Way back in September 2006, it was announced that Hideaki Anno was working on a film series titled Rebuild of Evangelion, a recreation of the iconic 1995 anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion, with much of the original staff brought back on to work on its development. Anno originally pitched the films as a remake of the anime without all the technological and production limitations he had when he first made the series. The first film, Evangelion 1.0 You Are Not Alone, retold the first 6 episodes of the original, condensed into a 96-minute runtime, while expanding on certain scenes and improving on the animation quality, all while hinting towards future events to come in the rebuild films. That said, while fans were generally content with how the film reimagined the original, it was understood that it simply couldn't replace it. In a similar fashion, while Evangelion 2.0 You Cannot Advance introduced a new Eva pilot and added scenes like Rei trying to organize a dinner for Shinji and his father, as a whole it kept to the general story beats of the anime. That was until the ending, where it drastically deviated from the plot of the original, instead having Shinji nearly trigger the third impact much sooner than it ever happened in the anime series, which set up the follow-up movie, Evangelion 3.0 You Cannot Redo, an extremely polarizing film that told an entirely new story separate from the original. While some loved the fresh take on the story that Anno was retelling by exploring new ways to examine beloved characters, others felt that this was a blatant cash grab by a hack director that never escaped the success of his creation, and that it couldn't come close to capturing the magic of the original. Fast forward to present day, and we're still left to linger in anime purgatory until whenever the final film, 3.0 plus 1.0 Thrice Upon a Time, is released to see what this was all leading up to, and if it was really worth it for Anno to take the risk of reimagining the masterpiece that was Evangelion. On a completely unrelated note, the remake of Final Fantasy VII was recently released, and as the internet has proven, there's a lot to talk about. When it was first announced at Sony's E3 press conference in 2015 that a remake for FF7 was in development, the gaming community had a collective meltdown. And the game has been the most anticipated release for the last 5 years for a significant amount of people, and for good reason. It can't be stressed how important Final Fantasy VII is for both fans of JRPGs and video games as a whole, as it quite literally defined the PS1 generation. For many, this game was their introduction to RPGs or video games handling complex themes like grief and loss. And for Square Enix, it's the franchise they've easily gotten the most mileage out of through things like the FF7 compilation series, which has been, let's say, hit or miss.
No.
Even if you've never played FF7, you likely know who Cloud and Sephiroth are and what the Buster Sword is, simply by how prevalent they've been throughout video game culture.
Very powerful.
Yes.
I like her big sword that she's dragging.
Excellent.
Ooh.
And then
But with excitement came big worry. What if they messed the remake up? What if we got the typical sad anime boy stereotype Cloud has devolved into, rather than the more nuanced dork that fails to act as cool as he thinks he is? What if reviving Aerith was made into DLC? What added to the stress was the reveal that the game would be broken up due to the sheer scope of FF7, given that the original itself was split across 3 discs. With that in mind, it was decided that the first part of the remake would focus exclusively on the Midgar section, which led to mixed reactions on how fair it was to release the game piecemeal like this. What did alleviate some concerns though were that much of the core creative staff on the original Final Fantasy VII were returning for the remake. The original director, Yoshinori Kitase, who initially proposed the remake project, was working as a producer. Tetsuya Nomura, who did the original designs and helped write the story, took on the role of director, and Motuma Toriyama, who did the event planning, was also co-directing. On top of that was Nobuo Uematsu coming back to assist with the music and creating the main theme, and Kazushige Nojima, who at first simply did the screenplay of the first game, was now taking on a larger story writing duty. If there was anyone who understood the significance of Final Fantasy VII, it was these people, who've been living in the shadow of their most iconic work for the last 20 years. So after the near 5-year wait, the remake is finally here, and overall it kept fairly close to the spirit of the source material. Of course, to make a full-length game out of a 5-hour section, scenes were added and moments expanded on, which was both a blessing and a curse. The ATB system was retooled to be more action-focused, while still incorporating elements of the turn-based mechanics, allowing for more cinematic-looking fights. Characters had more interactions between each other that helped to flesh them out, and side quests and combat missions were added into the main areas of the game. This is of course all extra content, and you can simply speed through the main story, though you would miss out on some of the best boss fights the game has to offer. But then there are chapters like the Ghost Train Yard and Hojo's Lab, which feel stretched out to the point that it messes up any sense of urgency in the story and needlessly drags on. Why are we having a subplot about ghosts that need to be put to rest when we're trying to get to our friends in the middle of a firefight? If this was another side quest and better developed, this sequence would have been solid. But as it is and where it is, it's an example of bad padding. As a whole though, there was plenty reference for the original FF7. The fact details like Hell House and Cloud's short run on RuPaul's Drag Race were implemented, and implemented with such love when many were worried they might be cut, shows that there was respect for wanting to bring Final Fantasy VII into the modern era in a satisfying and significant way, while still having a bit of fun with it.
Oh my god, that makeup! And that dress!
Nailed it, I know, thank you. Moving on.
But then the ending chapter happens, where after lulling players into a false sense of security that they got through the game without any major changes that would ruin FF7, Nomura reveals his hand and pulls the rug out from under everyone in the final moments of the game. Because it's here that the story goes full Kojima meta commentary on the player's ass, with Aerith winging to the audience as the main cast outright reject the predetermined fate of the original story they are being set on, while dropping a metric ton of Advent Children fan service, leaving what comes next entirely up in the air. And this is where we get the hard split on fan reactions to the remake, because oh boy are people divided on this.
They played us like a damn fiddle!
What doesn't help is that the ending of the game is vague and open to speculation, so every person has their own unique response how they feel about it. And for the sake of putting my cards on the table, I actually really enjoyed this ending. It's by no means perfect, it has the subtlety of a chair to the head, which is frankly to be expected from Mr. Darkness, Darkness, Light, Darkness Nomura, but I've been playing Kingdom Hearts for the last couple decades now, so I knew what to expect going in.
Cloud, you can have my light.
The light doesn't suit you.
I just don't know.
If this was the beat-for-beat remake that the majority of the game was being presented as, I would have still probably loved it. But the major deviations made me all the more interested in where they'll be taking in the future, even if it's off the proverbial cliff. Though me saying I liked it has probably placed me in a clear other group with some of you watching, as there's become a need for players to divide into camps based on how on board they are for Nomura's wild ride, which is possibly one of the most frustrating parts about the ending of this remake, since nuanced discussions about how people feel about the game have been taken out back to be put down like the old family dog. If I'm being honest, even doing this video was exhausting because I knew it would be tedious dealing with the strong reactions everyone's been having since the game came out. Due to the ambiguous nature of the ending and the narrative changes, FF7 Remake has become the gaming industry's last Jedi, which is a statement that's already given me PTSD war flashbacks. Though as much as I might enjoy the direction Nomura, Nojima, and the rest of the creative staff took with FF7, I'm also conflicted about it for a variety of reasons. There's a wide variety of angles to look at this remake from, because this ending has led to discussions of artistic integrity, fan expectations, marketing ethics, creative risk-taking, the writing of meta commentary, and most importantly, the nature of remakes. This is because FF7 is not a remake, but at the same time, it is a remake. And that confusing duality is where the game really exists, and honestly what makes it interesting to talk about, even if it results in hostile screaming matches. But hey, that's just your average art philosophy class. As a piece of art, 7R is a daring expression of creative control and explores what it means to remake a story so iconic like FF7 when it's so far removed from the time and context it was first made and released, while also being a generally fun game to experience. The game reflects on the inherent limitations and burdens there are for a creator revisiting a game with such high expectations and having to remake it so that it meets modern game design standards without changing anything so much that it would alienate old fans, which is always a tough balance to keep. As a consumer product, however, it borders on being a bold-faced lie. A lie that's necessary for the shock value of the ending and one of the primary themes of the game, but a lie that costs the player $80. and that's not going to sit well with some. While it's become a national pastime for some fans of the game to dunk on people that weren't into it, not everyone wants to pay to be bamboozled by the director so that they can make a postmodern argument about art, especially during a time when money's tight for a lot of people, and this might have been the one game a person allowed themselves to purchase for a while.
They took everything from us. Again.
In the lead up to the release, Nomura and the marketing assured that the remake was for old fans and newcomers alike, with Neil Pabin, the senior manager of product marketing at Square Enix, saying, "This is the perfect entry point for Final Fantasy." But that isn't entirely true. While I know a person new to Final Fantasy, or 7 in particular, could come into the game and have a fun time playing through it and learning what's going on without any real deep attachment to the series that might make them dislike the changes, anyone jumping into FF7 Remake without any real knowledge of the original are likely going to have to dig into the first game or have someone explain key details to fully grasp what the hell is going on, which honestly isn't the best way to experience a story. It'd be like starting on JoJo Part 3 rather than 1. I'm sure you'll have fun and get the general gist, but good luck knowing why the hell anyone cares about Dio or how he got Jonathan Joestar's body. This remake relies on player nostalgia for the original for maximum effect in how it manipulates the scenes and characters. There's constant references to events that are seemingly fated to happen, which Era seems to have knowledge of. You see visions of events from Crisis Core and Advent Children, the Wisps of Destiny force things to stay in line with the original story, the Genova clones are littered throughout but never actually explained, and apparently Sephiroth can bend the rules of space and time now. Some moments like Aerith dying are moments that those new to the story might be familiar with through cultural osmosis alone, but it's a game clearly made for a person who knows the events of FF7 and how these things are being manipulated. In that sense, FF7 Remake works more as a companion piece to the original than any sort of modern replacement. And yes, you can say semantically that it is technically remaking FF7, which is why it's the only remake to ever slap it right there in the title, almost as if to mock you with it, but many were under the reasonable assumption of what remaking classically means, being a straightforward retelling of the original with a few tweaks, and the marketing didn't do much to make them think otherwise. Admittedly, the devs were fairly upfront in interviews that there would be surprises and changes to come, even for those that think they knew what the story would be. But not every person is going to keep up with every comment from the creative staff that comes out, and they were incredibly vague about what those changes were regardless. If the game had been titled something like Remake or some other Nomura subtitle like Reborn, I'm certain that would have alleviated the issue a bit by writing the line between getting the point across and keeping the final trump card hidden, without outright pissing fans off who thought they were getting FF7 but with a new combat system and fully realized HD graphics. But this is where we get into the complicated, inherent meta nature of remakes and fan expectations of them. It's not as if this is the first time a game used deliberately misleading marketing for the sake of narrative subversions and cause a stir because of it. It's become a common comparison at this point, but Metal Gear Solid 2 famously did the same over a decade ago, where all the advertising was built around Solid Snake returning for another adventure by mostly highlighting scenes on the tankard while downplaying scenes with the new character Raiden. But in reality, Raiden was the actual lead of the game, which irked many fans that wanted to play their cool, badass soldier over this pretty anime boy. Nowadays, people have warmed up a lot to MGS2 and what it was saying, but initially it was incredibly divisive amongst fans, going by knee-jerk reactions. Along with a complex narrative about memes and information control, the plot relied heavily on you knowing what happened in the first game because it's using your knowledge of what happened on Shadow Moses to make a meta-commentary on sequel expectations and the misinformation of the digital age. In a way, FF7R is doing something fairly similar by using the remake itself to make a commentary on the nature of remaking games. Remakes above any other game are the type that are reliant on what its predecessor did since it's built using the skeletons of an older story. It's repeating history. Sequels or spin-offs in series are more or less allowed to be created as they are, and fans just hope their favorite aspects from the series are incorporated and improved on while telling a new story. Remakes have almost the same expectations, but much more restrictive, where they're held to tell an already told story, and any minute change that departs too far from the original is going to be heavily scrutinized, leaving little room to experiment. Obviously not every change will be hated necessarily, but it will be evaluated on how it stands up to what it's remaking. something which FF7R is attempting to challenge, even if it's doing it in a rather ham-fisted approach. I might be a pretentious hack that's smelling his own farts about art philosophy, but I'm not going to sit here and defend subversion for subversion's sake. And looking at FF7 Remake, it's clear that Nomura and the other devs are making a statement about the nature of remaking stories and how it relates to the fans and the creators, which some fan reactions are clearly confirming. Now, I hope this doesn't come off as strawmanning an argument, because I know those that don't like FF7R aren't only bothered by the changes and more how it was changed, but the amount of times I've seen petitions floating around for remaking a remake because it deviated a fraction of a hair too much proves that gamers can get extremely hung up on the idea that a remake should be a near exact recreation of the original that they wanted, but with a graphical touch-up and some gameplay improvements, with nearly zero allowance to explore new territory. I mean, for how long was there howling that Jill didn't have the exact same skirt in RE3 Remake as she did in 1999? You see what I mean? It definitely doesn't hurt that the point FF7 Remake is presenting is being made in a time frame where remakes are becoming more and more commonplace in the market either, because it's easy to tell creators that if they don't want to remake games they've done in the past, then they should stick to making new things. But it's not as if fans aren't constantly clamoring for older titles to be remade, as if a game expires once they reach a certain age. Personally, I know I would love to see a remake of DMC1 in the RE engine or MGS3 in the Fox engine. Hell, as soon as RE2 dropped last year, people are already speculating on when we would get remakes of 3 or Code Veronica. So it's clear that remakes are something developers can't easily ignore, which does stick them in a hard place of having to revisit older works to bring in modern gameplay designs, but feeling obligated to not deviate from the original ideas and execution that fans demand for. Which is almost contradictory in a way, because changing gameplay or the perspective, even slightly, can have a domino effect on how the story's told. I don't think you can honestly expect developers to explore different gameplay styles or art direction while still holding a near one-to-one recreation of the original story, because that excludes how the original game was influenced by all those factors together. And just to be clear, this isn't to demonize the concept of remaking games, because they definitely have their place in the industry. I love the RE2 remake from last year, Pokemon Soul Silver is my favorite Pokemon game ever, and I'm excited to see whatever Yoko Taro is doing with Nier, especially after he's seen what Nomura just pulled. But FF7 Remake calls into question why remake classic games in the first place if you aren't going to make some changes? And how much freedom do creators have in making those changes? Is there a limit to how far you can push it while still being the same game, or does it eventually become a Ship of Theseus problem? Sure, there definitely is merit to giving them a new coat of paint for a modern audience, but what value can there be in retelling the exact same story again, rather than exploring the characters and themes from a different angle like we have with plenty of other media? Though some of you might rightly say, why FF7 though? Why did it have to be this game that I've waited so long for that they had to make this stupid commentary with? Which I completely sympathize with. I do shed a tear for those that feel robbed they won't get the true experience of Final Fantasy VII that they wanted, especially since there's a non-zero chance scenes from Disc 2 and 3 might be replaced with Nomura constructing an elaborate explanation for how Cloud ended up in Kingdom Hearts. But on the flip side, I don't think a creator could make a point about remake culture like this with any game other than FF7, at least for it to have the level of impact it did. If the same was done with a Parasite Eve remake, would there be this much noise being made about it? In that respect, it kinda had to be FF7. A game couldn't make this kind of message without existing as a remake and breaking those conventions. And if you're gonna make that point, why not do it with a remake that had the highest, arguably unrealistic, expectations ever put upon it? Even if you don't love it, you have to admire the sheer guts the devs had for taking a risk like this, which could have completely flopped. And for some, it clearly did. But for many others, it landed right on the mark, even if it took going through the 5 stages of mourning to finally get there. Honestly, the thing about trying to recapture the magic of iconic games is it's nearly a misnomer, because these games were made in a specific time for a specific audience with specific creators and hardware limitations, so remakes are never going to truly capture that, and the pressure of doing so will always lead to failed expectations in some form or another. It can approximate the feelings the game created when you first played the original and bring you back for a moment, but it absolutely isn't going to be the same because it's an entirely different creation in a different age. And probably most importantly, you're a different person. Playing the Spyro pseudo remake in 2020, over 2 decades since the first came out, is going to be a disparate experience because it's no longer new and refreshing. The charm of Spyro's late 90s 2 that charmed you as a kid is likely going to feel less charming in a post-2010s world. Even RE2 Remake, which is a masterclass of readapting the original in the modern era, is still a vastly different game that can only try its best to maintain the game it's based on while still trying to be its own thing, which is also reflective in FF7. Nothing will ever truly capture the impact that FF7 had, because it came out when video games, especially JRPGs, were still on the fringes of the mainstream, at least in the West, which allowed it more freedom to be weird and niche for its time. In its own way, the original 7 was a huge risk too, as it drastically changed what the first 6 iterations were, tackling concepts like environmental protection, corporate greed, identity, and grief in a way video games never did before, which is why it left such a massive impression on so many. However, over 20 years later, things have changed, and what left a mark then is different than what would now, considering video games have evolved further and further following FF7's release, which further complicates the nature of going back to it even more. One of the greatest benefits that the original game had is that the player had to imagine and fill in gaps of details that the lo-fi Lego blocks graphics of the PS1 era couldn't really do. For the PlayStation, this truly was next level visuals and storytelling, and still holds up pretty well to this day. But in 2020, it's not exactly mind-blowing compared to what games can do now. For example, in the OG FF7, you don't actually see anyone die from the Sector 7 plate falling, so you have to extrapolate the damage that actually occurred from what the game is presenting you. But in an era where CG is nearing perfect photorealism and character performances through voice acting are factored in, a lot more work has to be done on the creator side to have the same emotional effect, since players can clearly see what's happening with all the pretty Unreal Engine 4 graphics. This does make sequences like walking through the destruction of Sector 5 stronger, where you can plainly see the damage caused by the bombing, which enhances the emotional turmoil some of the Avalanche group feel going through with further actions, but the trade-off is that as scenes and details are expanded and built up, the more it starts to crack under its own weight. And that's where the Jenga tower starts to wobble. Probably the perfect showcase of this dilemma is how the game handles Sephiroth, who's his own can of worms. Compared to the original Midgar section, where he was nothing but a background whisper, Sephiroth is upfront at all times in the remake, to the point you start to expect him to appear around every corner. Now, depending on how you feel about him, you either squeal with glee every time you see his perfectly modeled face, or rolled your eyes at how overused he was. Personally, I landed somewhere closer to the latter. For me particularly, the issue was less about how often he appears and more how he appears. It's lacking in any real subtlety. This could all be fixed by simply reframing these scenes so that you only get slight glimpses of him, especially if the game is calling into question Cloud's mindset with if Sephiroth is really there in the first place. Something like a hand on the shoulder, a slight whisper in Cloud's ear, a brief flash of him walking past and disappearing before Cloud can fully notice he's there. Because the amount of times he's seen casually standing around in daylight scenes is almost comical considering he's this game's Satan. But that's the fundamental issue with trying to remake Sephiroth. In 97, players didn't know who Sephiroth was outside of being that guy with the great hair in the trailers, so learning about him had this mystique and menace to it, not too different from how the characters felt chasing after him. But now, in a post-Theater Rhythm, Kingdom Hearts, Urgai's landscape, Sephiroth just doesn't have the same mystery he once had. One Winged Angel is the song everyone's waiting for at the Final Fantasy concerts, you can buy Sephiroth body pillows, and Sephiroth was the one everyone was excited to see in the remake trailers. Like Pyramid Head, Darth Vader, or any other villain character that leaks into the cultural zeitgeist, he's become the boogeyman of the series more than the original character he existed as. An idea to latch feelings onto. He's a marketing tool that Square can reliably bank on. What's his motives? Why is he the villain? It doesn't really matter because we all know he's the villain because that's what he represents for the series. So to a degree, I can see where the developers were coming from with how they use Sephiroth. With the amount of clamor for him, it's hard for them not to blow their Sephiroth load. So rather than trying to hide a character we're all incredibly familiar with, they bring him in center stage doing timeline shenanigans that feeds into the theme of change that runs throughout the story, where he directs the player to redirect the original game's timeline, which possibly includes his own defeat, while setting up plot points to explore in future installments. purely in terms of concept, that's a rad idea. Still not entirely sure what him being Advent Children Sephiroth from the future adds to his character though, but that's a conversation for another day. And that brings us to the most controversial part of the remake that I've been more or less dancing around addressing specifically. That being the plot ghosts. Now, in the game's lore, these whispers are the spirits of the planet, trying to maintain order and keep everyone on course with their destiny like an overbearing parent. But as everyone that spent 5 minutes in a high school English class has already pointed out, the ghosts aren't just the spirits of destiny. They're an analogy for the fans of FF7.
Great. More compilation trash.
God damn it, Namora again.
Oh my god, it's Zach! Oh, I'm gonna cry!
Though while I agree with the comparison, I'd argue it's better to interpret them as the pressures of fan expectation. They're the weight of having to remake something knowing it'll be scrutinized for every change made, down to the fact that Tifa is a half cup size smaller or that she's wearing thigh highs. They're the inherent limitations of working from a source material you're beholden to, especially a game with the sheer cultural impact that Final Fantasy VII had. This isn't any other game. Every change is going to be questioned on how it might act as a replacement of the original piece, which the devs weren't trying to achieve. As much as it might seem that this is a comment by the developers on how awful it is to deal with the fans of the series though, that's not quite the intention from my perspective. By the framing of the story, these time ghosts aren't intrinsically good or bad. They aren't a malevolent force that's used to take a metaphorical steaming dump on fans not willing to embrace change. They're overall indifferent to the morality of how they affect things, considering they help the main party as much as hinder them. They're a guiding hand meant to keep the story on the path as it should be when things start to diverge too much in an almost purely neutral sense, and only get explicitly aggressive in the last moments of the game in one final desperate attempt to maintain order. Change isn't easy for anyone to accept, even for the creators unsure about what the best route is. In a roundabout way, this is the developers fighting creative restrictions that are being put on them by fan expectations, even if they have the best intentions. In order to explore new ideas within this story, these are the beings that the creators have to push back against. That said, it isn't exactly an easy pill for everyone to swallow. Since the game came out, there's been a sentiment floating around that Nomura did all this maliciously, that he and his team were spitting in the face of fans with little regard to what they were doing so that they could pursue their own fanfiction. But I think more than anyone, Nomura and his fellow devs understand how important FF7 is. Seriously, listen to this line and tell me that it sounds like the ones writing it are doing all this without really thinking about it.
If we succeed, if we win, we'll be changing ourselves. I guess maybe that's why I hesitated.
It's clear that even Nomura's team themselves were apprehensive of what they were doing, knowing the weight of the project. But while fans have elevated FF7 to an ungodly standard that couldn't be exceeded, for them it still simply is a creation of theirs. When asked in 2016 if he thought there was anything untouchable from the first game, Katase stated,
I, along with Nomura-san and Nojima-san, who were involved with the remake, were involved with the original Final Fantasy VII. We were the people who created it, so in that sense, we don't think anything is untouchable. That isn't to say we're going to change everything. Of course, within Square Enix and across the globe, there are people who think it's on this holy scale, that there isn't anything we can touch or play around with. But we believe we know the balance between what can be changed versus what needs to be protected.
So while to some it might seem that Nomura and his team were being extremely flippant with the legacy of the series, it's not as if they don't respect what fans want or what FF7 means. I would say that the fact they recredited so much of the game with such love was them expressing that they know what needs to be maintained for the fans. It's them saying, yes, we understand what matters about this game, and while change will come, we will try to preserve the things you love. Honestly, probably the most interesting thing about FF7 Remake is how it relates itself to its predecessor. Rather than being a modern replacement of its origins by attempting to invalidate it, intentionally or not, 7R takes a different approach where the remake sits right next to the original by using timeline fuckery to incorporate the events of the first game's story into itself. Where video game remakes are typically used to modernize the games they're based on, the devs went out of their way to assure you that this wasn't meant to retcon the original Final Fantasy VII out of existence. And if anything, this remake has made the PS1 game more relevant than it's ever been in the last 10 years. While I might have my gripes about how it creates issues with the actual storytelling of the game, the fact the OG FF7 is now essential information for the remake, leading many who've never played it before to go back to experience it, ensures that this old classic will continue to have its place in the industry for a long time to come. Obviously, creators can't escape the complicated meta nature of remakes. That's just how they exist. You can hope they stand alone, but they'll always be judged on how they adapt, recontextualize, or outright change the story or characters. But that doesn't have to be a hindrance. If they're willing to play around with it and even own it, creators can make that into a strength. Now, we obviously have no idea where FF7 Remake will go from here, whether it's going in a drastically different direction, or there's going to be some general tweaks but an overall similar story. Katase has stated future parts won't completely deviate from the original, but they also led players to assume we were getting a traditional remake only to hoodwink us, so I take that with a grain of salt for now. I mean, Nomura's put vital information for his long-running series in a mobile game. This is a man that can't be controlled. At this point, the future of FF7 is unknown, and that's kinda terrifying, but also exciting in a way. Both new and old fans are now left waiting to see what will come next together, rather than expecting the next piece of an HD remaster of something they've experienced before. And I respect that. Sometimes when making art, you do have to take risks. I know that's not going to please everyone, and change can be frightening, but if developers only ever played it safe, there's a good chance we never would have gotten the original FF7 in the first place. And maybe the next part's going to be complete garbage and waste any potential the first game set up. But that's the inherent nature of creating. It's never going to be perfect or exactly what you want. But as every YouTuber who's talked about the game has already stated, whether it's joy or fear, let's embrace whatever might come together.